The shadow of death lingered in the small wooden house on the outskirts of Rawlins, Wyoming Territory, 1873, where Madeline Kane sat alone in the darkness, her tears falling silently as the single oil lamp flickered and died. The once bustling home that had echoed with laughter was now eerily quiet, save for the occasional sob that escaped her trembling lips. 3 weeks since they'd laid Thomas in the ground, and still the pain felt as fresh as the moment the mining accident had claimed him. The spring rain pattered against the roof, its steady rhythm doing little to soothe her aching heart. At 26, Madeline hadn't imagined she'd be a widow, left alone with a small ranch she could barely maintain and memories that haunted her day and night. Her slender fingers twisted the simple gold band on her left hand, 4 years of marriage cut short by cruel fate. A sudden knock at the door startled her from her grief. Madeline hastily wiped her tears with the back of her hand, wondering who would call at this late hour. Rising from her chair, she pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and made her way through the darkened house. "Who's there?" she called, her voice hoarse from crying. "Quinn Hayes, madam. Got caught in the storm driving cattle, saw your place from the ridge. Hope I'm not disturbing you." Madeline hesitated, her hand on the latch. Strangers could mean trouble, especially for a woman alone. But the spring nights were cold, and she couldn't bring herself to turn away someone in need. Thomas would never have done so. She opened the door a crack, the hinges creaking. The man standing on her porch was tall and broad-shouldered, his hat dripping with rain. Lightning illuminated his face for a brief moment, weathered by sun and wind, but kind eyes that held no threat. He couldn't have been more than 30, with a strong jaw covered in stubble and dark hair plastered to his forehead from the rain. "Your lamp went out," he observed softly. "I thought maybe the place was abandoned until I heard." He trailed off, not wanting to mention the sounds of her crying. Madeline pulled the door open wider. "Come in, Mr. Hayes. No sense in you catching your death out there." He stepped inside, removing his hat respectfully. "Much obliged, madam." As Madeline lit a fresh lamp, the warm glow revealed the cowboy more clearly, trail-worn clothes, a gun belt that had seen years of use, and eyes that had witnessed more of life than his years suggested. "I can offer you some coffee and a place by the fire," she said, moving to stoke the dying embers in the hearth. "That's mighty kind. My men are camped about a mile back with the herd. I told them I'd scout ahead for shelter." He remained standing, water pooling around his boots on the wooden floor. "Are you here alone, madam?" The question, though innocent enough, caused Madeline's throat to tighten. Yes, my husband." She swallowed hard. "My husband passed 3 weeks ago, mining accident." Quinn's expression softened with genuine sympathy. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Kane. Madeline Kane," he nodded solemnly. "Mrs. Kane." As she busied herself with the coffee pot, Madeline became acutely aware of how long it had been since she'd had company. The silence between them was broken only by the crackling fire and the persistent rain. "You're driving cattle through this weather?" she asked, seeking to fill the quiet. 500 head, he replied, finally settling into a chair after she gestured for him to sit. "Bringing them up from Texas to the railroad in Cheyenne. Been on the trail 6 weeks now." Madeline set a steaming cup before him. "That's a long journey." "It is." Quinn took a sip, sighing with appreciation. "Good coffee, thank you." Another silence fell, more comfortable than the last. Madeline found herself studying the stranger in her kitchen, the way his large hands cradled the coffee cup, the tired lines around his eyes that softened when he smiled. "The storm should pass by morning," she said, glancing toward the window where rain lashed against the glass. "You and your men are welcome to use the barn for shelter tonight." Quinn looked up, surprise evident in his expression. That's generous of you, Mrs. Kane. Most widows wouldn't be so trusting of a group of trail hands. My husband believed in helping those in need, she replied, a hint of pride in her voice. I won't dishonor his memory by turning away travelers in a storm. The cowboy studied her for a long moment. He sounds like he was a good man. He was. Tears threatened again, and Madeline turned away, busying herself with needless adjustments to items on the shelf. Quinn rose from his chair, setting down the empty cup. I should go back and tell my men. We'll be quiet and respectful of your property. Madeline nodded, not trusting her voice. As he moved toward the door, she heard him pause. Mrs. Kane, she turned to face him, composing herself. I couldn't help but notice earlier, when I came to the door. His voice was gentle, almost hesitant. I heard you crying in the dark. Madeline felt heat rise to her cheeks, embarrassment mingling with grief. No need to explain, he said quickly. Loss is a hard trail to ride. I just wanted to say. Quinn met her eyes with a steady gaze that somehow conveyed both strength and compassion. You'll never cry alone again, not while I'm near. That's a promise. The simple words, spoken by a stranger who owed her nothing, broke something loose inside Madeline. A tear slipped down her cheek before she could catch it. Thank you, Mr. Hayes, she whispered. But I'm afraid loneliness is my path now. He shook his head slightly. Nobody's path has to be walked alone, Mrs. Kane, not if they don't want it to be. With that, he settled his hat back on his head and stepped out into the rain, leaving Madeline standing in her doorway, watching as his figure disappeared into the darkness. The morning brought clear skies and the low, distant sound of cattle lowing. Madeline rose earlier than usual, taking extra care with her appearance, a fact she tried not to examine too closely. She pulled her dark hair into a simple but neat bun and selected a dress that, while still appropriately somber, wasn't the same black garment she'd worn for days. From her porch, she could see activity around her barn, men loading supplies, checking gear, preparing for another day on the trail. Among them was Quinn Hayes, his tall figure easily distinguishable as he directed the operation with quiet authority. Madeline busied herself preparing a larger breakfast than she'd made since Thomas died. By the time she heard boots on her porch and a respectful knock, she had a table laden with biscuits, bacon, and eggs. Mrs. Kane, Quinn greeted her, hat in hand. Beside him stood an older man with silver-streaked hair and a weathered face. This is my trail boss, Samuel Walcott. We wanted to thank you properly for your kindness last night. Samuel nodded respectfully. Madam, you've got a fine barn, kept us and the horses dry through that downpour. You're both welcome, Madeline replied. I've made breakfast if you and your men haven't eaten yet. The two men exchanged glances, and Samuel cleared his throat. That's mighty generous, but we've got a dozen hungry cowboys out there, madam. Wouldn't want to impose. I've cooked for hungry men before, Mr. Walcott, she said with a small smile, the first genuine one in weeks. My husband worked the copper mines with 20 others, and they'd all come by on paydays. I know how to feed a crowd. Quinn's eyes sparkled with appreciation. In that case, we'd be fools to refuse. Within the hour, Madeline's small house was filled with the sounds she'd missed: conversation, laughter, the scrape of chairs and clatter of plates. The cowboys were respectful, removing hats and washing up before entering her home, minding their language and expressing genuine thanks for the meal. Quinn remained after the others had filed out, offering to help clean up. As they worked side by side washing dishes, Madeline felt a strange sense of comfort in his presence. Your husband's spread seems well maintained, he commented. Were you planning to keep it running? Madeline sighed, setting a plate on the drying rack. I don't know that I can. Thomas handled most of the livestock and repairs. I've been trying, but—" She gestured helplessly. "The bank's been patient so far, but without the mining income, I'm not sure how long I can hold on." Quinn was quiet for a moment. "How many acres?" 80. Small by Wyoming standards, but it was ours. Madeline's voice caught on the last word. "There's good grazing, a reliable spring. Thomas had plans to expand the herd eventually." "What about family? Anyone who could help?" She shook her head. "My parents are back east. They never approved of me coming west with Thomas. His family's all gone." Quinn dried his hands on a towel, his expression thoughtful. "Mrs. Kane, I hope you don't find this presumptuous, but my outfit will be moving the herd slowly. We'll be in the area for about a week before pushing on to Cheyenne." He hesitated, then continued. "Some of my boys are handy with repairs. We could help get things in order before we move on. No charge, just repayment for your hospitality." Madeline stared at him, pride warring with practicality. "Mr. Hayes, I couldn't possibly—" "I'm not offering charity," he interrupted gently. "Just neighborly help, the kind of thing that keeps folks alive out here." Looking into his earnest face, Madeline found she couldn't refuse. The roof needed patching, the corral had broken posts, and the small herd of cattle Thomas had accumulated needed attention she couldn't provide. "A few days," she conceded finally, "and I'll feed your men while they're working." Quinn smiled, a warm, genuine expression that reached his eyes. "Deal." True to his word, Quinn arranged for a portion of his crew to remain behind with a small section of the herd while the others continued the drive at a slower pace. Over the next few days, Madeline's property transformed. The Cowboys repaired fences, patched the leaking roof, fixed the creaking windmill, and tended to her neglected livestock. Quinn himself seemed to be everywhere at once, splitting wood at dawn, mending broken furniture in the afternoon, and discussing the property's potential in the evenings. Each night, Madeline cooked for the men, and each night, Quinn lingered after the others returned to their camp in the pasture. On the third evening, as they sat on her porch watching the sunset paint the Wyoming sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, Madeline found herself sharing stories about Thomas and their life together. "He had such dreams for this place," she said softly, rocking gently in her chair. "We came out here with nothing but hope in each other." Quinn listened attentively, his own chair still. "He built something good, something worth preserving." "Maybe," she conceded, looking out over the land that now seemed less like a burden and more like a promise. "But I'm not sure I'm the one to preserve it." "Why not?" Madeline turned to look at him, surprised by the directness of the question. In the fading light, his profile was strong against the sunset, a face that somehow seemed both new and familiar to her now. "Because I'm just one woman, Mr. Hayes. This land needs a family, children, strong hands. Things I don't have anymore." Quinn was silent for a long moment. "My father used to say that strength isn't always in what you have, but in what you're willing to fight for." He met her gaze steadily. "You've got more fight in you than you realize, Mrs. Kane." "Madeline," she said suddenly. "Please call me Madeline. After all you've done, Mrs. Kane seems too formal." A smile touched his lips. "Madeline," he repeated as if testing the sound of it. "Then I'm Quinn, not Mr. Hayes." The simple exchange felt significant somehow, a small barrier lowered between them. They sat in comfortable silence as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. "Will you tell me about your life, Quinn?" she asked finally. "You know so much about mine now, but you've shared little of yourself." He chuckled softly. "Not much to tell that would interest a lady." "Try me," she challenged gently. Quinn leaned back in his chair, hat resting on his knee. "I was born in Missouri. Father was a farmer who lost everything in the war. Headed west afterward, but fever took both my parents before I was 16. His voice carried no self-pity, just simple facts. Worked ranches in Texas, drove cattle, saved my wages. This drive is my first as part owner of the herd. You've come a long way, Madeline observed. Still going, he replied with a small smile. Have my eye on land in Colorado. Good water rights, room to grow. Been saving for 5 years now. A dream worth pursuing, she said, understanding the value of such aspirations. Quinn nodded, his expression growing more serious. Lost my wife 7 years ago. Childbirth. He said it simply, but Madeline could hear the old pain beneath the words. Never thought I'd consider building another life with someone. The admission hung in the air between them, laden with unspoken meaning. Madeline felt her heart quicken, both in sympathy and something more complicated. I'm sorry, she said softly, for your loss. And I for yours, he replied. After a pause, he added, grief's a strange trail. No map, no markers, just putting one foot in front of the other until eventually the landscape starts to change. Madeline considered his words, finding truth in them. Has your landscape changed, Quinn? His eyes met hers in the gathering darkness. I believe it might be starting to. The moment stretched between them, charged with possibility. Then Quinn rose from his chair, settling his hat on his head. It's getting late. I should let you rest. Madeline stood as well, suddenly reluctant to see him go. Thank you for the company and everything else. He paused at the top of the porch steps, turning back to face her. In the silver moonlight, his expression was both gentle and intense. Madeline, he said her name like a promise. When I found you crying in the dark that night, I meant what I said. No one should face their sorrows alone. With that, he descended the steps and walked into the night, leaving Madeline with a curious warmth despite the cool evening air. The next morning brought a complication in the form of Elijah Stanton, the banker from Rawlins. His buggy rolled up to Madeline's house just as Quinn and 2 other cowboys were replacing a section of the corral fence. Madeline met Stanton on the porch, aware of Quinn's curious gaze from the corral. Mrs. Kane, the banker greeted her with a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. At 45, Stanton was considered a good catch in Rawlins, a widower with a successful business and political ambitions. He'd made his interest in Madeline known even before Thomas's death, in ways subtle enough to be dismissed, but persistent enough to be uncomfortable. Mr. Stanton, she replied coolly, what brings you out this way? Concern, my dear. He glanced past her at the cowboys working on her property. I heard you had visitors. Given your vulnerable situation, I thought it prudent to check on your welfare. Madeline bristled at his presumption. As you can see, I'm perfectly fine. These men are helping with repairs before continuing their cattle drive. Stanton's expression hardened slightly. Out of the goodness of their hearts, I suppose. Be careful, Mrs. Kane. Not everyone has your best interests at mind. And you do. The words slipped out before she could stop them. The banker straightened his waistcoat. I've always been honest about my admiration for you, Madeline, even more so now that you're in need of protection and support. He lowered his voice. Your loan payment is due next week. Given the circumstances, I could arrange an extension. Perhaps over dinner in town. Before Madeline could respond, she heard boots on the porch steps behind her. Quinn approached, removing his hat politely but standing close enough to make his presence felt. Morning, he greeted Stanton with a neutral expression. Quinn Hayes. The banker gave him a dismissive once-over. Elijah Stanton. I own the bank in Rawlins. Mr. Stanton was just leaving, Madeline said firmly. Stanton's lips thinned. Consider my offer, Mrs. Kane. A woman alone faces many challenges in this territory. I could ensure your security. His gaze flickered to Quinn. Permanent security, not temporary assistance from drifters. Quinn's expression remained impassive, but Madeline noticed the slight tension in his shoulders. "Thank you for your concern, Mr. Stanton, but I can manage my own affairs," she replied, her tone making it clear the conversation was over. The banker replaced his hat with a tight smile. "As you wish. I'll expect you at the bank next week then." With a curt nod to Quinn, he returned to his buggy. As they watched him drive away, Quinn broke the silence. "Friend of yours," Madeline sighed. "Hardly. He's been attentive since we arrived in Rawlins. Thomas always dealt with him for the loan." She hesitated, then added, "He's made it clear he sees my widowhood as an opportunity." Quinn's jaw tightened. Some men mistake vulnerability for availability. "He does have a point about the loan," Madeline admitted reluctantly. "It's due next week and I don't have enough to cover it." Quinn turned to face her fully. "How much do you need?" She shook her head quickly. "I wasn't hinting for help, Quinn. That's my burden to bear." "Not hinting or not, I'm asking," he persisted. "How much?" Madeline hesitated, then named a sum that represented 2 months of Thomas's mining wages. Quinn nodded thoughtfully. "I might have a solution that doesn't involve Stanton's protection," he said. "Let me talk to Samuel." Before she could protest further, he was striding toward where the trail boss was inspecting her small herd of cattle. Madeline watched them in earnest conversation, gesturing occasionally toward the animals. By midday, Quinn returned with a proposition. "Samuel agrees your stock is healthy. We can incorporate your cattle into our drive to Cheyenne, sell them with ours, and you'll have enough to cover your loan and then some." Madeline stared at him in surprise. "But that would leave me with no herd at all." "For now," Quinn acknowledged. "But you'd keep your land free and clear, which is the foundation of everything else. Cattle can be replaced, your home can't." She considered his words, knowing he was right but feeling the weight of the decision. Thomas had been so proud of their small herd, the beginning of their dreams. "I'd have to accompany the drive," she said finally. "Those cattle are all I have left. I need to see the sale through myself." Quinn's eyebrows rose slightly. "It's a rough trail for a woman alone." "I won't be alone," Madeline replied, meeting his gaze steadily. "I'll be with you and your men, won't I?" A slow smile spread across his face, respect evident in his eyes. "That you will. We leave day after tomorrow." The next day was a flurry of activity as Madeline prepared for the journey. She packed essential clothing, secured the house, and wrote to inform the bank she'd be bringing payment upon her return. Quinn and his men helped integrate her 20 head of cattle into their larger herd, teaching her the basics of the trail driving they'd be doing. On the eve of their departure, Madeline stood in Thomas's study, a small room off the main bedroom where he had kept his mining maps and journals. Her fingers traced the spine of his leather-bound diary, the last record of his thoughts and dreams. A soft knock at the open door drew her attention. Quinn stood there, hesitant to intrude on such a private moment. "Sorry," he said. "Just wanted to let you know everything's ready for morning." Madeline nodded, clutching the diary to her chest. "Thank you. I was just saying goodbye, I suppose." Quinn stepped into the room, his gaze taking in the maps on the walls, the mining equipment on the shelves, the remnants of a life cut short. "Not goodbye," he suggested gently. "Just until you return." "Will I?" she asked softly, voicing the doubt that had been growing. "Return, I mean. Sometimes I wonder if there's anything left for me here without him." Quinn moved closer, stopping a respectful distance away. "Only you can answer that. But remember, he built this place for both of you. Your dreams were here too." Madeline looked up at him, struck by how well he seemed to understand her thoughts. "My dreams were tied to his. Now I'm not sure what my own dreams look like." "Then maybe this journey is about more than cattle," Quinn said. "Maybe it's about finding those dreams again." She considered his words, finding wisdom in them. "You're very insightful for a cowboy, Quinn Hayes." A smile tugged at his lips. "Don't tell my men. They think I'm just good with cattle and bad weather." The light moment eased the heaviness in her heart. Madeline returned the diary to its place on the shelf, a silent promise to return to it with clearer purpose. "I should get some sleep," she said. "Dawn comes early, I imagine." Quinn nodded. "Earlier than you'd like, but the mornings on the trail, there's nothing quite like them. Sky stretching forever, dew on the grass, the whole world waking up around you." His voice carried genuine affection for the life he led. As they walked from the study, Madeline paused in the doorway of the main room, looking around at the home she and Thomas had built. For the first time, the thought of leaving it didn't feel like a betrayal. "Quinn," she said softly, turning to face him in the dim lamplight. "Thank you, not just for the help with the cattle or the repairs, but for—" She searched for the right words. "For reminding me there's still a path forward, even if it's not the one I expected to walk." His eyes held hers for a long moment. "Sometimes the unexpected path leads to the best views," he said simply. Then, with a gentle tip of his hat, he bid her good night and stepped out into the darkness. As promised, they departed at dawn. Madeline rode astride on her own mare, wearing split skirts that Thomas had once commissioned for her practical clothing that had scandalized the town but suited their life on the edge of wilderness. Quinn rode beside her at the head of the procession, while the other cowboys managed the herd behind them. The first day on the trail was an education in itself. Madeline, accustomed to hard work but new to cattle driving, absorbed every lesson eagerly. She learned the rhythms of the herd, the importance of steady movement, the signals passed between riders. By evening, when they made camp along a creek, she was exhausted but exhilarated. "You're a quick study," Quinn remarked as they sat by the fire after supper. The other men were engaged in a card game nearby or tending to night watch duties, leaving them in a pocket of relative privacy. "Most first-timers are done in by noon." Madeline smiled, rubbing her sore muscles. "I'll feel it tomorrow, I'm sure, but it feels good to be doing something purposeful again." "Purpose has a way of healing," Quinn agreed, poking the fire with a stick. "After Rachel died, my wife, I threw myself into work, took the hardest drives, the worst conditions, anything to keep moving." "Did it help?" Madeline asked quietly. Quinn considered the question. "Not at first. Exhausted my body, but not my grief." He looked up at the star-filled sky. "Time did what work couldn't, and eventually I started to feel something besides loss again." Madeline followed his gaze upward, where the Milky Way stretched across the Wyoming sky like a river of light. "I'm starting to understand that. Yesterday was the first day I didn't wake up and immediately remember he was gone. I felt guilty when I realized it." "Guilt's a useless emotion when it comes to healing," Quinn said. "The dead don't want our suffering as tribute." His words struck a chord deep within her. Thomas had been so full of life, so determined to build something lasting. Would he truly want her to remain frozen in grief? "What made you stop taking the hardest drives?" she asked. "What changed?" Quinn's eyes returned to the fire. "Realized I was running from life instead of toward it. Started saving for my own place instead. Gave me something to work for, not just something to escape into." Their conversation was interrupted by Samuel approaching with a coffee pot. "Refill." As the older man poured the hot liquid into their cups, he cast an appraising glance at Madeline. "You held your own today, Mrs. Kane. Most city folks would be crying for a wagon by now." Madeline laughed softly. "I'm tougher than I look, Mr. Walcott." "Sam," he corrected with a wink. "Anyone who can ride 12 hours and still smile has earned the right to use my given name." After Samuel moved on, Quinn chuckled. "You've impressed him. That's not easy to do." "And you?" Madeline asked, surprising herself with her boldness. "Have I impressed you as well?" Quinn's expression grew serious, his eyes reflecting the dancing flames. "From the moment I met you, Madeline Kane, a woman facing the darkest night of her soul with dignity and strength, that's more impressive than any cattle drive." His words warmed her more than the fire or coffee. For the first time since Thomas died, Madeline felt truly seen, not just as a widow to be pitied or a woman to be pursued, but as herself, with all her complexity and capability. "We should get some rest," Quinn said after a comfortable silence. "Tomorrow's a longer day." He helped her set up her small tent, ensuring she had privacy while remaining close enough to the group for safety. As they said goodnight, Quinn hesitated, then spoke softly. "I meant what I said that first night, you know, about not crying alone." His voice was gentle but firm. "If the nights get hard out here, you don't have to face them by yourself." Madeline nodded, touched by his continued concern. "Thank you, Quinn. Good night." "Good night, Madeline." As she settled into her bedroll, listening to the night sounds of the prairie and the occasional low of the cattle, Madeline realized she felt more at peace than she had in weeks. The pain of loss hadn't vanished, but somehow, out here under the vast sky, it seemed to have found its proper place in her heart, present but no longer consuming. Sleep claimed her quickly, and for the first time since Thomas died, no tears dampened her pillow. The journey to Cheyenne continued for 5 more days, each one bringing new challenges and small triumphs. Madeline's skills improved rapidly under Quinn's patient guidance. She learned to spot strays before they wandered too far, to predict the herd's movements, to weather the discomforts of trail life with increasing resilience. On the 3rd day, they encountered their first significant obstacle, a river swollen with spring runoff. The crossing point they'd planned to use was running too high and fast for safety. "We'll need to head north," Samuel decided after surveying the churning waters. "There's a shallower ford about 5 miles upstream." The detour cost them half a day, but Quinn used the opportunity to teach Madeline more about reading the land and weather. They rode slightly ahead of the herd, their horses walking side by side as he pointed out landmarks and signs. "See those clouds building to the west?" he asked, gesturing toward the horizon. "Flat bottoms, fluffy tops. They'll bring rain by evening, but likely nothing severe." Madeline studied the sky with new interest. "Thomas always said he could smell rain coming. I thought he was teasing me, but he was rarely wrong." "The air changes before a storm," Quinn confirmed. "Gets heavier, carries different scents. Your husband had good instincts." "He would have liked you," Madeline said thoughtfully. "He valued honesty and hard work above all else." Quinn glanced at her, a question in his eyes. "Does that matter to you? Whether he would have approved of friendships you form after him?" The careful way he phrased the question wasn't lost on Madeline. She considered her answer seriously before responding. "I think I'm learning that honoring his memory doesn't mean living as if time stopped when he died." She met Quinn's gaze steadily. "Thomas wanted me to be happy, whatever form that happiness might take." Something shifted in Quinn's expression, relief, perhaps, or hope. Before he could respond, a shout from behind drew their attention. One of the younger cowboys was racing toward them, pointing urgently back toward the herd. "Rustlers," he called, "coming fast from the south ridge." Quinn's demeanor changed instantly, the trail master replacing the thoughtful companion. "Get back to Samuel," he instructed Madeline firmly. "Stay with the chuck wagon and keep your head down." Before she could protest, he was wheeling his horse around, drawing his rifle from its scabbard in one fluid motion. 3 riders had appeared on the ridge south of their position, and more were emerging from the tree line beyond. Madeline hesitated only briefly before racing back toward the main group. Samuel was already organizing the defense, positioning men strategically around the herd while keeping it moving toward the river crossing. "Mrs. Kane," he called when he spotted her. "Get behind that outcropping with the supplies. This shouldn't take long." From her position of relative safety, Madeline watched as the confrontation unfolded. Quinn and 4 of his men rode to meet the approaching rustlers, weapons visible but not yet raised. Words were exchanged that she couldn't hear, but the body language was clear. The rustlers had expected an easier target and were reconsidering their approach. After tense moments, the would-be thieves turned their horses and disappeared back over the ridge. Quinn watched them go, remaining vigilant until they were well out of sight before returning to the herd. When he rode up to check on Madeline, his expression was grim but relieved. "Sorry about that. They recognized we were too well armed to risk it, but we'll keep extra watches tonight." "Does that happen often?" she asked, her heart still racing from the encounter. "Often enough," Quinn replied. "Cattle are valuable and not everyone wants to work honestly for their living." He studied her face. "You all right? You're looking pale." Madeline took a deep breath. "Just reminded me how dangerous this life can be. Thomas always said the West made men either very good or very bad with little room in between." Quinn nodded thoughtfully. "There's truth in that. Out here, consequences are immediate and often final, tends to clarify a person's character." His expression softened. "You're handling this well. Most women would be demanding to turn back about now." "I'm not most women," Madeline replied with a small smile. Quinn's gaze held hers for a moment longer than necessary. "No," he said quietly, "you certainly aren't." They reached the shallower crossing by late afternoon and managed to move the herd across before making camp. As Quinn had predicted, rain began to fall shortly after sunset, a gentle but persistent shower that sent everyone seeking shelter early. Madeline sat in her small tent, listening to the raindrops on the canvas and writing in the journal she'd brought along. By the light of a small lantern, she recorded the day's events and her evolving thoughts about the journey, both the physical one to Cheyenne and the emotional one she hadn't anticipated. A shadow appeared outside her tent, followed by Quinn's voice. "Madeline, got some hot coffee if you'd like." She invited him in, making space in the small enclosure. Quinn ducked through the opening, bringing with him the scents of coffee, rain, and leather. He handed her a steaming cup, then settled cross-legged on the ground cloth, careful to keep a respectful distance. "Thought you might want to warm up," he explained. "Nights get cold when it rains like this." "Thank you," she said, grateful for both the coffee and the company. "I was just writing about today's excitement." Quinn nodded toward her journal. "Good to keep a record." "The memories fade faster than you'd expect, even the dangerous ones. Or perhaps especially those," Madeline suggested. "The mind protects itself." "True enough." Quinn sipped his coffee, his expression thoughtful. 2 more days to Cheyenne if the weather holds. We should arrive in time for the weekend cattle auction." The reminder of their impending arrival brought a mix of emotions for Madeline. The practical matter of selling her cattle and securing funds for the loan payment was nearly resolved, but with it came the question of what would follow. "What happens after Cheyenne?" she asked, voicing the uncertainty that had been growing. Quinn studied his coffee cup. "For the outfit, we collect our pay and decide on the next drive. For me personally." He looked up, meeting her eyes. "That depends partly on you, Madeline." Her heart quickened at his words. "On me. I've been thinking about what you said earlier about honoring memories without being trapped by them." His voice was steady, but she could sense the careful consideration behind each word. "I haven't felt this way about anyone since Rachel died. Didn't think I could or would, but these days with you." He trailed off, searching her face for a reaction. Madeline felt a rush of conflicting emotions: hope, fear, guilt, longing. It seemed impossible that in just over a week this man had come to mean so much to her. "Quinn," she began, not entirely sure what she wanted to say, "this has all happened so quickly. A few weeks ago I was a wife. Now I'm a widow on a cattle drive, selling everything my husband and I built together." "I understand," he said quietly, "and I'm not asking for promises, just possibility. A chance to see where this might lead, when you're ready." The sincerity in his eyes touched her deeply. This wasn't Elijah Stanton's opportunistic pursuit of a vulnerable widow. This was something more genuine, a connection neither of them had sought but both now recognized. "I think possibility is something I can offer," Madeline said finally. "But I need time, Quinn, to finish grieving, to decide what my future looks like." Relief softened his features. "Time is something I can give. And whatever you decide about returning to your ranch or seeking something new, I'd like to be part of that conversation." He set down his empty cup and moved toward the tent opening. "I should let you rest. We move out at first light." Before he could leave, Madeline reached out, her fingers lightly touching his arm. "Quinn," he paused, looking back at her. "Thank you," she said softly, "for seeing me as more than just a widow to rescue." Quinn's smile was warm in the lantern light. "You were never in need of rescuing, Madeline Kane. Just perhaps a reminder of your own strength." With that, he slipped out into the rainy night, leaving Madeline with thoughts both unsettled and hopeful. The remainder of the journey passed without further incident. The weather cleared, allowing them to make good time across the rolling Wyoming landscape. By the afternoon of the sixth day, the outskirts of Cheyenne came into view, a bustling frontier town transformed by the arrival of the Union Pacific Railroad into an important shipping point for cattle heading east. As they approached the stockyards on the edge of town, Madeline felt a curious mix of accomplishment and apprehension. The practical goal of the journey was nearly achieved, but the personal journey had taken unexpected turns she was still processing. Quinn rode up beside her as the first buildings of Cheyenne appeared on the horizon. "Your first cattle drive is almost complete," he observed with a smile. "How does it feel?" "Bittersweet," she admitted. "I'm proud we made it, but selling Thomas's cattle feels like closing a chapter I wasn't ready to end." Quinn nodded in understanding. "Endings and beginnings often come tangled together out here. The trick is recognizing which is which." They entered Cheyenne just before sunset, directing the herd toward the large stockyards where the auction would be held the following day. Samuel handled the paperwork, while Quinn helped Madeline secure separate pens for her cattle, ensuring they would be properly accounted for in the sale. "There's a decent hotel on Central Avenue," Quinn told her as they walked their horses toward town after settling the herd. "The men usually bunk at the drovers' quarters by the yards, but you should have proper accommodations." Madeline glanced at him, noting the respectful distance he maintained even after the closeness that had grown between them on the trail. "Will I see you tomorrow for the auction?" "I'll be there," he promised. "These cattle represent your future. I wouldn't miss seeing that secured." The hotel was modest but clean, a welcome change from sleeping on the ground. After a proper bath and meal luxuries that felt almost foreign after the trail, Madeline sat by the window of her room, watching the activity on Cheyenne's Main Street below. Cowboys, businessmen, soldiers from the nearby fort, and women of varying social stations moved through the early evening bustle. A knock at her door roused her from her observations. Opening it, she found Quinn standing in the hallway, freshly shaved and wearing a clean shirt beneath his trail-worn vest. "Hope I'm not disturbing you," he said. "Just wanted to make sure you were settled in all right." Madeline smiled, stepping back to invite him in. It feels strange to have 4 walls and a proper bed again." Quinn entered, hat in hand, his gaze taking in the simple room. After enough time on the trail, even the most basic comforts seem luxurious. "Would you like to sit?" she offered, gesturing to the small table by the window. They settled across from each other, the familiarity of their trail conversations carrying over despite the changed surroundings. Quinn updated her on the auction preparations and the favorable prices cattle were commanding. "Your 20 head should bring more than enough to cover your loan payment," he assured her. "You'll have funds left to decide your next steps." "I've been thinking about those next steps," Madeline said carefully. "The journey here has given me time to consider options I hadn't before." Quinn waited, giving her space to continue at her own pace. "I'm not sure I want to return to the ranch," she admitted finally. "Not permanently, at least. Without Thomas, it's just a place. The dreams we had for it were shared dreams. I need to find my own now." Understanding showed in Quinn's expression. "Have any ideas about those new dreams?" Madeline took a deep breath. "Maybe. I've always been good with numbers and accounts. Thomas used to say I could make sense of figures better than any bank clerk. There might be opportunities in a growing town like this for someone with those skills." Quinn nodded thoughtfully. "Cheyenne's booming with the railroad. Businesses need reliable bookkeepers." A smile touched his lips. "You'd be good at it. You have a mind for details. You notice that about me?" She asked, surprised. "I notice everything about you, Madeline," he replied simply. The honesty in his voice brought warmth to her cheeks. For a moment they sat in companionable silence, the sounds of the town floating up through the open window. "What about your Colorado land?" she asked finally. "After the auction, will you head there?" Quinn leaned forward slightly, his expression earnest. "That depends on whether I might have reason to consider Wyoming instead." His eyes held hers steadily. "I meant what I said on the trail. I'd like to see where this connection between us might lead, if you're willing." Madeline felt her heart quicken. The past 2 weeks had transformed her world completely, from grieving widow to trail-hardened cattle seller, from a woman lost in darkness to one beginning to see new possibilities. And through it all, Quinn had been a steady presence, offering support without demanding dependency. "I think," she said slowly, choosing her words with care, "that I'd like that too. But slowly, Quinn, I'm still finding my footing in this new life." Relief and happiness transformed his features. "Slowly is fine by me. We've got time." He reached across the table, his hand palm up in invitation. "Partners then, at least to start." Madeline placed her hand in his, the simple contact sending a flutter through her chest. "Partners," she agreed. Their shared smile held promise, and understanding in equal measure, 2 people who had known loss finding unexpected connection on the trail forward. The cattle auction the following day exceeded all expectations. Demand was high, and Madeline's healthy stock fetched excellent prices. By midday, she had secured nearly twice the amount needed for her loan payment, the remainder providing a comfortable cushion for her next steps. Quinn stayed by her side throughout, helping navigate the complexities of the auction and ensuring she received fair treatment. His presence drew curious glances from other cattle buyers and sellers. A woman in the stockyards was unusual enough, but one clearly under the protection of a respected trail boss attracted particular notice. "Congratulations," Quinn said as they left the auction house, the bank draft safely tucked in Madeline's reticule. "You're officially a successful cattle seller." She laughed, the sound light and genuine. "Thanks to you and your men, I couldn't have done this alone." "You did the hard part already," he replied, making the decision to move forward instead of staying stuck in the past. The rest was just logistics. They walked through Cheyenne's busy streets, discussing possibilities. Quinn would remain in town for several more days while his men collected their pay, and the trail boss finalized accounts with the cattle buyers. Madeline decided she would use that time to explore opportunities in Cheyenne before making any final decisions about her future. "I should return to Rawlins briefly," she explained as they shared lunch at a small cafe, "to pay the loan and collect some personal items, but I could be back within a week." Quinn nodded, understanding her practical concerns while hoping for her return. "I'll look into property options here while you're gone. For both of us," he added with a smile. "Separately, of course, until you decide otherwise." The acknowledgement of propriety while still expressing his intentions was perfectly balanced, Madeline thought. So different from Elijah Stanton's presumptuous approach, or the pitying looks from others in Rawlins who saw her only as Thomas's grieving widow. "Quinn," she said suddenly, reaching across the table to touch his hand, "when you found me that night, crying in the dark, did you have any idea we'd end up here?" He shook his head, his eyes warm with affection. "Not specifically. But I knew the woman I met that night had more strength than she realized. I just hoped I'd get to see her discover it." 3 days later, Madeline boarded the eastbound train to Rawlins. Quinn saw her off at the station, the platform crowded with travelers and well-wishers. "1 week," she promised as the conductor called for boarding. "I'll settle matters with the bank and be back before you know it." Quinn took her hand, pressing it briefly between both of his. "I'll be waiting." "Safe journey, Madeline." As the train pulled away from the station, Madeline watched his figure grow smaller until it disappeared from view. For the first time since Thomas's death, she felt genuinely hopeful about what lay ahead, not just accepting of her fate, but actively curious about the possibilities. The journey to Rawlins took the better part of a day. Arriving in the late afternoon, Madeline headed directly to the bank, where Elijah Stanton's surprise at her appearance was matched only by his disappointment when she paid the loan in full. "You sold the cattle?" he asked, barely concealing his displeasure as he counted the money. "That was your husband's pride and joy." "Yes," Madeline replied calmly, "and now it's provided for my future just as he would have wanted." Stanton's lips thinned. "I see. And what future might that be, Mrs. Kane? Surely not alone on that remote ranch." "My plans are my own, Mr. Stanton," she said firmly. "But thank you for your concern." Leaving the banker with his thwarted ambitions, Madeline headed to her property. The house stood exactly as she had left it nearly 2 weeks earlier, but somehow it felt different, smaller, perhaps, or simply less significant in the grand scheme of her life. She spent the next 2 days sorting through belongings, separating what to keep, what to sell, and what to leave behind. Thomas's journals and personal effects were carefully packed, along with clothing, family heirlooms, and practical items she might need. The furniture and larger household goods she decided to sell, along with the property itself. On her 3rd day in Rawlins, Madeline visited the local lawyer to place the ranch for sale. As she was leaving his office, she encountered Mrs. Peterson, the wife of the general store owner and one of the town's most prolific gossips. "Mrs. Kane." The older woman exclaimed with exaggerated sympathy. "We've been so worried about you disappearing like that. Some said you'd abandoned the property entirely." "Not abandoned, Mrs. Peterson. Just exploring new opportunities," Madeline replied politely. The woman's eyes narrowed with interest. "Opportunities? My dear, what opportunities could possibly compare to the security of marriage? Mr. Stanton has made no secret of his willingness to take you under his protection." Madeline smiled, no longer bothered by the town's expectations. "I've found that protection isn't what I need, Mrs. Peterson. But thank you for your concern." As she walked away, Madeline realized how little the opinions of Rawlins society mattered to her now. The journey with Quinn and his men had shown her a different kind of respect, one based on capability rather than convention. On the morning she was to depart for Cheyenne, Madeline made one final visit to Thomas's grave in the small cemetery on the edge of town. She placed fresh wildflowers beside the simple marker and stood in quiet contemplation. "I hope you understand," she said softly to the stone that bore her husband's name. "I'm not forgetting our dreams, just finding new ones that I can build alone, or perhaps not entirely alone." The early summer breeze rustled the prairie grass around the cemetery, carrying the scent of sage and distant mountains. Madeline took it as a sign of acceptance, a blessing from the man who had always wanted her happiness above all else. "Goodbye, Thomas," she whispered, touching the stone one last time. "Thank you for loving me enough to bring me west. The journey continues, just differently than we planned." With that final farewell, Madeline returned to town and boarded the westbound train, her heart lighter than it had been in months. The past would always be part of her, but now the future beckoned with new promise. Quinn was waiting at the Cheyenne station when her train arrived, his tall figure easily spotted among the crowd. Seeing him there, hat in hand and anticipation in his eyes, confirmed what Madeline had been realizing throughout her week away. Her feelings for this man had grown beyond simple gratitude or companionship. "Welcome back," he greeted her, taking her bags with a warm smile. "How was your journey?" "Enlightening," she replied, matching his smile with her own. "I've sold the ranch, or at least listed it for sale, and I've brought what matters most with me." Quinn's eyebrows rose slightly. "That's a big decision." "The right one," she assured him. "I've spent enough time looking backward. I'm ready to focus on what's ahead." As they walked from the station into the bustling streets of Cheyenne, Quinn updated her on his week's activities. He'd secured temporary lodgings for himself and had inquired about business opportunities in town. Several merchants had expressed interest in hiring someone with accounting skills, particularly a widow with a respectable background. And, he added with a hint of pride, "I found a small house for rent on the north side of town. 2 bedrooms, sturdy build, decent yard. Nothing fancy but clean and proper." "For me?" Madeline asked, touched by his thoughtfulness. Quinn nodded. "If you decide to stay in Cheyenne, no obligation, of course, but I thought you might want options beyond the hotel." "I'd like to see it," she said, her decision already forming. "And Quinn, thank you for understanding what I needed, even when I wasn't entirely sure myself." His expression softened. "You've done the same for me, Madeline, reminded me there's more to life than work and duty." Over the following weeks, Madeline settled into Cheyenne and her new life. The rented house proved perfect for her needs, close enough to town for convenience, but with enough space to feel like a real home. She secured a position keeping books for 2 of the larger mercantile establishments, work that utilized her skills and provided a steady income. Quinn divided his time between helping her settle in and preparing for his next cattle drive. Though he would need to leave for several weeks, he promised to return to Cheyenne afterward, instead of continuing to Colorado. "My plans have changed," he told her simply when she asked about his long-held dream of land in Colorado. "Some dreams can be adjusted when better ones appear." Their relationship progressed with careful consideration for propriety, but growing affection. They dined together regularly, attended church on Sundays, and spent evenings on Madeline's porch talking about everything from childhood memories to hopes for the future. Physical touch between them remained modest, a hand offered to help her from a carriage, fingers brushing when passing a book, an occasional embrace in moments of particular emotion. Both understood the need for patience. for allowing their connection to deepen naturally without rushing past Madeline's still healing grief. The night before Quinn was to depart with another cattle drive, they sat together on Madeline's porch swing, watching fireflies dance in the early summer twilight. A comfortable silence stretched between them, broken eventually by Quinn's contemplative voice. "I'll be gone 6 weeks, maybe 7, he said. "Trail to Nebraska this time, not as far as the last drive." Madeline nodded, her hands folded in her lap. "I'll be here when you return." He turned slightly to face her more directly. "Will you write to me?" "Samuel will make sure letters reach me at the supply points." "Of course," she promised. "Daily happenings in Cheyenne may not be as exciting as a cattle drive, but I'll share what news there is." Quinn smiled, then grew more serious. "Madeline, I want to ask you something before I go." "Not a proposal, not yet, but a question about where we stand." Her heart quickened at his words. "Ask me." "When I return," he said carefully, "would you consider allowing me to court you properly? No more pretense of just friendship or partnership. I want to be clear about my intentions, both to you and to others in town." The question, though not unexpected, still sent a rush of emotion through Madeline. In the 3 months since Thomas's death, she had traveled further than just the physical distance between Rawlins and Cheyenne. She had journeyed from devastating grief to cautious hope, from dependence to self-reliance, from a woman lost in darkness to one stepping confidently into light. And Quinn Hayes had been beside her for much of that journey, never pushing, always supporting. "Yes," she said softly but without hesitation. "I would like that very much." The joy that transformed his features was worth any lingering doubts she might have harbored. Quinn reached for her hand, bringing it gently to his lips in a gesture both old-fashioned and deeply sincere. "I'll count the days until I return," he promised. The following morning, Madeline stood at the edge of town, watching as Quinn rode out with his men and the new herd bound for Nebraska. Unlike the day Thomas had left for his last shift at the mine, this parting carried promise rather than finality, a comma in their story, not a period. True to her word, Madeline wrote regularly during Quinn's absence. Her letters chronicled her growing confidence in her work, her deepening connections in the community, and her quiet reflections on their evolving relationship. His responses, delivered sporadically when the drive crossed paths with eastbound riders, were filled with trail observations and increasingly open expressions of his feelings for her. 6 weeks stretched to 7, then 8 as unexpected weather delayed the drive. Madeline found herself watching the western road each evening, anticipating Quinn's return with a mixture of excitement and newfound patience. Her life in Cheyenne had taken solid shape, friendships formed, routines established, a sense of belonging growing steadily. When word finally came that Quinn's outfit was approaching town, Madeline felt a curious sense of completion. The circle that had begun that rainy night when a stranger knocked on her door was somehow being drawn to its proper conclusion. She waited on her porch as the riders entered Cheyenne, the setting sun painting the street in golden light. Quinn broke away from the main group when he spotted her, urging his horse forward at a quicker pace. He dismounted in front of her gate, removing his hat as he approached the steps where she stood. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, taking in the changes wrought by their time apart. Quinn appeared leaner, his skin darker from weeks in the sun, but his eyes held the same warmth she remembered. To him, Madeline seemed to glow with a confidence that hadn't been fully formed when he left a woman who had found her place in the world. "You're back," she said simply. "I am," he replied, climbing the steps to stand before her. "And you're still here." "I promised I would be." Quinn's smile deepened. "You did. And I've learned your promises mean something, Madeline Kane. Without further words, he opened his arms in invitation. Madeline stepped into his embrace, fitting against him as naturally as if they had held each other 1,000 times before. His arms encircled her gently, respectfully, yet with a certainty that spoke of coming home. When they drew apart, Quinn kept hold of her hands. "I have something to ask you," he said. "But not tonight. Tonight I just want to be here with you, knowing tomorrow comes after." Madeline understood. There would be time for formal questions and life-changing answers. For now, it was enough that he had returned and she had waited, both choosing this moment with full awareness of its meaning. "Welcome home, Quinn," she said softly. His smile conveyed everything words couldn't yet express. "It does feel like home," he agreed, "for the first time in years." 2 days later, after Quinn had settled his business with the cattle buyers and ensured his men received their proper wages, he came to call on Madeline properly. Dressed in his best clothes, which still carried the unmistakable character of a working cowboy rather than a town gentleman, he arrived with flowers and an invitation to dinner. They walked together through Cheyenne's evening streets to a small restaurant that had become one of Madeline's favorites during his absence. The familiar surroundings allowed conversation to flow easily as they caught up on details their letters hadn't covered. After dinner, Quinn suggested a detour on their walk home. "There's something I'd like to show you if you're not too tired." Curious, Madeline agreed. He led her toward the northern edge of town, past her rented house and into an area where newer construction was expanding Cheyenne's boundaries. They stopped before a partially built structure, the framework complete but much of the finishing work still to be done. "What is this place?" she asked, confused by their destination. Quinn's expression held anticipation and a touch of nervousness. "It's going to be a house. My house, potentially." Madeline looked at him in surprise. "You're building here in Cheyenne. What about Colorado?" "Like I said before, plans change when better dreams come along." He took her hand, leading her closer to the construction site. "I purchased the land while I was away on the drive. Started the building just before I left. The work continued while I was gone." He guided her through the open doorway into what would eventually be the main room. Even in its unfinished state, Madeline could see the care that had gone into the design. Large windows positioned to catch both morning and afternoon light. A generous hearth that would warm the entire space. Doorways leading to what would be several bedrooms. "It's lovely," she said sincerely. "But I don't understand. Why show me tonight?" Quinn turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. In the fading evening light that streamed through the unglazed windows, his expression was both vulnerable and resolute. "Because I wanted you to see it while it's still becoming. Like us." He took a deep breath. "Madeline, I'm building this house with hope. Hope that someday when you're ready, not before, you might consider sharing it with me, as my wife." The directness of his words, so characteristic of the man himself, touched Madeline deeply. This wasn't an impulsive proposal, but a deliberate statement of intention, offering her both clarity and freedom. "I'm not asking for an immediate answer," Quinn continued. "Just for you to know that my feelings haven't changed, except perhaps to grow stronger with time and distance. I love you, Madeline Kane. I think I have since that first night when I found you crying in the dark and promised you wouldn't cry alone again." Tears welled in Madeline's eyes, not of grief this time, but of overwhelming emotion. The journey from that night to this moment seemed both impossibly long and surprisingly brief, a passage of healing and discovery that had led her to this unfinished house and this good man. "Quinn," she began, her voice steady despite her tears. "When Thomas died, I thought my future died with him. I couldn't imagine finding joy again, let alone love." She squeezed his hands gently. But you showed me that grief isn't the end of the story. It's just a chapter. She looked around at the half-built house, seeing not its current state but its potential, much as Quinn had seen potential in her when she was wrapped in darkness. "I don't need more time," she said, returning her gaze to his hopeful face. "I know what I want, and it's a future with you." "Yes, Quinn Hayes. When this house is ready, I would be honored to share it with you as your wife." The joy that transformed his features was something Madeline knew she would remember for the rest of her life, pure and unrestrained. The expression of a man who had found his heart's desire after believing it lost forever. Quinn drew her gently into his arms, one hand cupping her cheek with exquisite tenderness. "May I?" he whispered, his intention clear. At her nod, he lowered his lips to hers in their first kiss, gentle yet fervent, a promise sealed in the golden light of sunset streaming through the bones of what would become their home. When they finally parted, Quinn rested his forehead against hers, his voice husky with emotion. "I meant what I said that night, you know. You'll never cry alone again." Madeline smiled through happy tears. "I believe you, just as I believe we'll share more joy than sorrow in this life we're building." They were married that autumn, as the aspens in the nearby mountains turned to gold, and the first crisp hints of winter touched the Wyoming air. The ceremony took place in their newly completed home, with Samuel Walcott standing as Quinn's best man and several of Madeline's new friends from Cheyenne in attendance. Madeline wore a dress of deep blue rather than traditional white, acknowledging her past while embracing her future. Quinn, in a new suit that couldn't quite disguise the cowboy beneath, watched her walk toward him with wonder in his eyes, as if still amazed by the journey that had brought them together. Their vows were simple and heartfelt, promises spoken with the straightforward honesty that had characterized their relationship from the beginning. No flowery sentiments or elaborate declarations, just two people who had known loss, pledging to build something meaningful together. That evening, as they stood on the porch of their new home watching the sun set over the western plains, Quinn wrapped his arm around his wife's shoulders. "Happy?" he asked softly. Madeline leaned into his embrace, remembering the darkness that had once seemed impenetrable and the light that had gradually returned to her world largely because of the man beside her. "Yes," she replied, her heart full, "and grateful. For the journey that brought me here, even the painful parts." Quinn pressed a kiss to her temple. "Every trail has its purpose, if we're willing to follow where it leads." As twilight deepened around them, Madeline Hayes thought of the woman she had been crying alone in the dark, and the woman she had become. The grief hadn't vanished entirely. It had simply found its proper place in her heart, a sacred space that honored what was lost without preventing what could still be found. In the years that followed, the Hayes home became known throughout Cheyenne for its warmth and hospitality. Quinn continued his cattle business, eventually purchasing land outside town, where he raised his own herds rather than driving others. Madeline maintained her bookkeeping work until their first child arrived, a daughter they named Rachel Thomas Hayes, honoring both the past and the future. Two more children followed, sons who grew up strong and capable under their father's guidance, learning both the practical skills of ranching and the more important lessons of compassion and integrity that Quinn exemplified. Madeline taught them numbers and letters, history and science, but also the value of resilience in the face of life's inevitable sorrows. On the 10th anniversary of their meeting, Quinn presented Madeline with a special gift, a small silver locket containing miniature portraits of them both, engraved with the words that had first connected them: "Never alone again." As she fastened it around her neck, Madeline reflected on the truth of that promise. The darkness had come again at times throughout their years together, the loss of a baby between their second and third children, the year when drought threatened their livelihood, Quinn's injury from a horse that nearly took him from her. But true to his word, she had never faced those shadows alone. And more importantly, the light had always returned in their children's laughter, in quiet evenings on their porch watching Wyoming sunsets, in the steady companionship of a love built on mutual respect and genuine affection. "What are you thinking about?" Quinn asked that night as they sat together after the children were asleep, his hand warm around hers. Madeline smiled at the man who had ridden out of a rainstorm and into her broken life a decade earlier. "I'm thinking about promises kept," she said simply, "and paths taken." Quinn brought her hand to his lips in a gesture that had become familiar but never routine. "Any regrets?" "Not one," she replied with absolute certainty. "Every step led here, exactly where I was meant to be." In the comfortable quiet that followed, Madeline Hayes gave silent thanks for the courage that had allowed her to move beyond grief into hope, beyond darkness into light, beyond solitude into the rich, complex joy of a life fully lived and deeply loved.